The Nintendo 64. You heard of this? Now, this was never a console I owned as a kid, but
some of my earliest memories involve visiting my cousins over the summer and watching them play Star Fox 64, Super Mario 64, Battle Tanks, and Banjo-Kazooie.
one time, when gearing up to play Star Fox 64 multiplayer, my cousins handed me a controller, and my first thought was, why does it have 3 penises? The Nintendo 64 controller. This was Nintendo's first finalized attempt at a joypad made specifically for player movement in a 3D space. With its dead center joystick and 3-pronged scythe-shaped design.
It raises some questions.
Miyamoto, you big goof. I only have 2 appendages. We don't have
An arachnid figure like you.
We can't live up to your impossible body standards. So, why was the controller designed this way? Let's take a look.
Before the analog stick, the majority of home console players were accustomed to operating in, at most, 8 directions, using a D-pad or joystick. Both of these forms of control are either push-button or switch-based, and therefore only allow binary inputs. You're either pressing a direction, or you're not. And so, this meant that console manufacturers were tasked with finding a means of allowing players to move in a full 360 degrees on a home console in a way that felt both fluid and intuitive to the player.
They had their work cut out for them.
Solving this problem was one of the key elements that guided the Nintendo 64 controller's design.
That and a goofy little platformer called Super Mario 64.
It's me, Mario! Hello!
Some assume that Mario 64 in its entirety was built around the controller, but the reality is a bit more complex.
For the first 6 months of development, Mario 64 was designed using a combination of keyboards and modified Sega joypads, using an emulated version of the Nintendo 64 running on SGI indie workstations.
During that time, prototypes of the Nintendo 64 controller were developed, all built around one central feature.
There were lots of Nintendo 64 controller prototypes, probably at least 100 prototypes, mostly based around the central stick. How that moved, how well it moved, what shape the thing around it should be. It ended up 7-sided, but we tried many, circles, etc. Giles Goddard, programmer, Super Mario 64. According to Goddard, it was the design of the Nintendo 64 controller's analog stick that informed Mario's in-game movement, and the C buttons informed how to develop Mario 64's camera movement. Essentially, the Nintendo 64 controller was designed in tandem with Super Mario 64, and ideas for the game informed the design of the controller, and vice versa. Now, let's say that technology frightens you, and you can't be within 10 feet of a Nintendo 64 without readying the hammer you've got nestled between your clappers, and therefore you don't know what an analog stick is. It's essentially an evolution of the joystick intended for a single thumb. It iterates on both the joystick and D-pad by allowing for more nuance and character movement than either the joystick or D-pad could provide. This is done through the use of potentiometers, which use electrical impulses to measure the exact position of the stick within its range of motion. The Nintendo 64 controller's analog stick, however, functions more like a ball computer mouse or a trackball. Moving the controller's analog stick moves 2 wheels that are positioned vertically and horizontally inside of the controller. These wheels are located inside of 2 small slots that each contain an LED and a photodiode. Light from the LED shines through tiny rectangular holes around the edge of each wheel into the photodiodes. The light shining into the photodiodes creates an electric current, and the movement of the wheels change the amount of light, and therefore the amount of electric current that the photodiodes create. The Nintendo 64 can then understand the analog stick's exact position from the current that the photodiode gives the system. For example, in Super Mario 64, you can push the analog stick just a little bit to make Mario walk, or push the analog stick all the way to make Mario run. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, it's not an analog stick if it uses digital measurements. To those people, please consider that I don't fucking care. The Nintendo 64 controller stick emulates the functions of a true analog stick, so I'm just gonna keep calling it that for the sake of expediency. As mentioned earlier by Goddard, the analog stick doesn't rotate in a perfect circle. It has little divots that help lock the stick into certain directions. More specifically, up, down, left, right, and the diagonals between those positions. Essentially, all the possible button options you would have with a D-pad. This provided a tactile response that allowed the player to perform more precise movements, like side or back flipping in Super Mario 64. This meant the player could, just by feel, know that the stick was pointed dead left or straight up, for example, without having to look down at the controller to ensure that the direction of the stick precisely matched their exact intentions.
So that answers the analog stick. But why does the controller have 3 floppers?
This ultimately was done as a means to give the player multiple play options depending on the game. This is why there are 3 control options that correspond to the 3 fins: the D-pad on the left fin, the analog stick on the center fin, and the C buttons on the right fin. The D-pad exists for 2D games and player familiarity, the analog stick for 3D character control, and the C buttons for camera angle changes. Because of the controller's 3 control options, the biggest flaw of the controller seems to be that you can't access all of the controller's buttons, specifically the left shoulder button and D-pad, without completely removing your left hand's contact with the controller. This apparent design flaw is in part the result of what Nintendo's R&D team felt was the best solution for integrating old and new controls, and, at least in theory, providing veteran players with a stepping stone from the D-pad to the analog stick. During a February 1996 interview with Next Generation magazine, Genyo Takeda, former general manager of Nintendo's integrated R&D division, mentioned that, "Many people tell me the cross key is kind of the common sense to use. We could not give it up as today's players are stubborn. They want to use the cross key." It's smooth brain conspiracy theory time. In addition to providing different control styles, it almost feels as though the design choice to separate the D-pad and analog stick onto different fins was done to force stubborn players to adapt to using the analog stick, especially since the overwhelming majority of first-party Nintendo 64 games didn't use the D-pad at all. This leads me to my next point, back in reality. Developers were well acquainted with the controller's button access limitations, as well as potential player confusion, and addressed it in various ways. As I mentioned earlier, many developers attempted to solve the Nintendo 64 controller's button access limitations by choosing not to use the D-pad at all, and the developers that did choose to use the D-pad usually presented it as an optional alternative way to play. Speaking of alternative ways to play, some developers attempted to solve the button access issue by following Nintendo's design philosophy for the controller, providing the player with multiple control options. This was especially true for first-person shooter games, which, while using their default controller schemes, usually had limited player camera control since there's only 4 C buttons. Not great for precise aiming. A couple examples of titles that offer multiple control options are Doom 64 and GoldenEye 007. Doom 64 gave you 5 control styles, as well as the ability to customize every button, except for the analog stick. GoldenEye, on the other hand, had a whopping 8 ways to play using the controller, including 4 modes that use 2 controllers for dual analog control: Plenty, Galore, Domino, and Good Head. None of these feel, quite like modern analog control. Aside from the fact that you're juggling 2 controllers, these modes either swap camera control to the left hand and character movement to the right hand, or have this super weird amalgamation where you have partial camera movement and partial character control on each stick. But what about the inaccessible left shoulder button? Like the D-pad, most developers chose either not to use the L button or relegated it as an alternative way to play. Many devs chose to replace the unreachable left shoulder button with an additional button found underneath the center fin, the Z button. This trigger-shaped button was used in a variety of ways, such as locking on in Star Fox 64, Z-targeting in Ocarina of Time, or firing in GoldenEye. On June 27, 1997, Sony released an updated controller for the PlayStation that ultimately finalized the modern controller design that other console manufacturers, including Nintendo, later adopted. This gamepad was called the Dual Analog Controller. It was subsequently redesigned and re-released 5 months later, this time called the DualShock. I think this is a much better design, as it's both ergonomic and allows access to all the controller's buttons without repositioning your hands. And it adds a second analog stick, eventually used for modern camera control. The Nintendo 64 controller was ultimately a massively flawed but foundational step in developing a means for the player to move in a 3-dimensional space in a way that felt intuitive. Though many games on the console ended up feeling way less than intuitive in terms of control, in no small part because developers had to work around the quirks and limitations of the controller.
Though this controller is bizarre to look at in retrospect, it's pretty understandable to see how Nintendo arrived where they did regarding the design of this controller.
Nintendo has a history and a sickness of chasing novelty, and along with that, providing unique, novel, and weird ways to interact with their consoles. You can also see this trend in future consoles like the Wii's Wiimote, Nunchuck, and Classic controller options, as well as the Switch with its Joy-Cons, Pro Controller, and Nintendo Labo. Bottom line, when you're forging a brand new path in terms of player-character interaction, and you're a company all about novelty, you're gonna make some wacky choices and missteps. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what I do, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get the latest notifications for new videos. I've also got a brand new Patreon up, which will give you early access to new videos, as well as upcoming exclusive content, and more. Now just to clarify, subscribing to Patreon will never, ever be mandatory, but it would be a big help in terms of helping me keep going with this channel. Please check it out.
I'm Zach with Shivering Pixel. Thanks once again for watching. Bye-bye.